Hey everyone, welcome to another AI conversation. I'm joined today by Ankur Patel, who is actually a best-selling author of several books. I actually have one book, which is the hands-on unsupervised learning, and I'm very happy to have him here. He's also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first AI founder we have on conversation, and that's really good. Speaking as a founder myself, I want to hear from Ankur. So, hey Ankur, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, you're I think in the AI and machine learning circles, especially through your books, I think you're pretty well known. But maybe for the rest of for the few people who don't know who you are, maybe can you give just a brief background and what are you up to these days?
Yes, of course. Happy to give a background. So right now, I'm the founder and CEO of an AI startup based here in New York City called Multimodal. We work on workplace automation, so helping companies, particularly in finance and legal, with very complex, thorny manual workflows. We help them automate that using AI. It's areas like KYB, KYC, compliance workflows, insurance workflows, and such. That's what I focus on today. Now, this is my third startup. So I am the co-founder of a company called Glean AI, also New York City based. It's a vendor spend management platform that takes invoices, extracts information out of those invoices, and has a complete bill pay platform for CFOs to pay their vendors as well as get a better understanding of their spend over time. Prior to that, I ran the machine learning team of a firm called Seven Park Data, which we ended up selling to Vista Equity Partners. Really interesting stories there because we took esoteric data sets like email receipt data, credit card receipt data, point of sale data, foot traffic data, clickstream data, and such, and we packaged them up into data products for hedge funds to use. We ended up selling that to Vista Equity Partners. I stuck around for a year afterwards to help Vista's portfolio companies really adopt artificial intelligence. And this was in 2019 primarily. Also started the data science office for an Israeli startup in cybersecurity, working for both insurance companies and tier one banks. And then before that, I have hedge fund experience. So I ran a macro hedge fund, was a trader at Bridgewater, some deep finance background. And along the way, as you pointed out, I've written two books, one on unsupervised learning and then one on natural language processing, which came out 2 years ago. And it's aptly named because it's called Applied NLP in the Enterprise, which is exactly what my company Multimodal does today.
Yeah, I mean that's really great background. And I'd love to get into kind of the weeds of what you're doing in your companies. But maybe we could start with kind of your journey as a founder. I saw from your bio you started out in the finance sector as an analyst. So can you talk a little bit about how that happened? So in many ways, we share a similar background. I also started in banking, and now I'm also doing AI work. So for you, how was that transition from finance, and then you mentioned hedge funds, and then now running several AI startups?
Yeah, I think for me, I got into startups at a time when startups weren't quite as popular. So I graduated in 2009 from Princeton, got into finance in New York City, which is about an hour and a half away from Princeton geographically. So a lot of the graduates there end up going to New York to work in consulting or banking typically. Um, Now I started out at JP Morgan as an analyst in 2009. This is just coming out of the 2008 2009 crisis, and so banks weren't really a fun place to be. Startups weren't also exactly a great place to be in the sense that they were still recovering, if you can imagine, from the tech bubble, and then in a lot of the activity was still concentrated in the Bay Area, right? So in New York City, there wasn't quite as much presence. But I worked at JP Morgan for a little bit, then left to work at a smaller company. In this case, it was Bridgewater, which is the world's largest hedge fund, one of the most successful hedge funds ever. And I became a trader there. And for me, it was a better fit because I went from a company that had over 10,000 people, JP Morgan, to a company that had 800 people, where I felt a little bit closer to the product, closer to the core business. And I love trading. I love following markets. I love analyzing a ton of data. And then making decisions where to place bets. I loved it so much that 2 years after Bridgewater, I said, hey, I really want to do my own thing. I love building something from scratch. Bridgewater's awesome, but it'll be here with or without me, right? And I think my DNA was very much go and build something from scratch. So I left that. I was 24 at the time. A very controversial decision, as you can imagine, leaving a very large, successful hedge fund to go and do something on my own in 2011, 2012, at a time when startups still weren't mainstream, weren't in vogue as they are today. And I did a hedge fund for 5 years after that. It was a macro hedge fund, but we used alternative data. So we were using data science, not so much machine learning in those days in 2012. But a couple of years in, we did start using machine learning, using NLTK and Stanford NLP, some of the early NLP libraries to analyze all of this alt data, and we used it to make investment decisions. We couldn't quite get scale at that startup, at that hedge fund, so we shuttered the business. I left that, and then I ran machine learning teams at 2 other startups before I did my second, which was Glean AI in 2019. Right, so there was a long gap between closing my startup in 2016 and then 3 years later starting my second startup, Glean AI. And I left Glean AI earlier this year to do multimodal, which is my third startup. So most of my professional career has been building from 0 to 1 in very early stage startup. Even the 2 startups that I did that I worked for in 2017 and 2018 and then 2019, they were also Series B startups, so not very late stage startups. We did exit one to Vista Equity Partners, but I love the seed, Series A, Series B juncture where you're still building product hands-on. You're managing a team that's very close to the product, and then you're scaling once you get traction. I love that. As you can see, that's why I'm doing so many startups along the years. This being my third.
Yeah, it seems like you're really getting into the build process. In many ways, I relate to that. But first, you mentioned natural language toolkit in finance. Now that would be awesome to talk a little bit about. So were these algorithmic trading bots, or more of decision-making tools back in the day?
So we actually use the NLP here primarily to analyze central bank statements and other speeches and testimonies that were given by central bankers, because we were macro shop, right? So we're analyzing what is the Fed's take, or the Bank of Japan's take, or the ECB's take, Bank of England's take, like all these central banks around the world. We're trying to see what their take was on inflation and growth. Are they positioned for raising rates, cutting rates? Are they getting sensitive to anything that's happening in the macro economy? That's what we were focused on primarily. And to do that, we wanted to analyze sentiment. We wanted to understand changes in language. Central bankers have a very structured way of talking. And we use that to basically get real-time analysis of the language and changes in the language, which then fed our investment model. So the investment model wasn't using data science necessarily, although some of it was, but a lot of it was basically old school, rules-based, take the signals that basically mimic the way we would interpret the market. So the way that we were analyzing the markets, we coded that into a set of rules using code, of course. But we weren't using an ML model for the actual trading or the decision making, but we were using NLP to extract signals from unstructured and semi-structured text primarily. And then we expanded that, of course, but that was really the extent of the NLP back in those days.
Yeah, and it looks like at Seven Park and Glean, you kind of took that NLP background with you. So, without getting to too many specifics about obviously your proprietary work, for people who are looking to practice NLP, like in any industry, do you have any like top 5 things to be looking at in terms of principles, algorithms, or like the way you would approach a problem from an NLP standpoint?
I think it's changed quite a lot, right? So I think before 2018, before BERT from Google, it would have been using Spacey and Stanford NLP and NLTK and some of these older ways of operating to extract features from text and use those features in some, let's say, tree-based model, or basically some model to make decisions, to do classification or sentiment analysis or topic modeling. That's typically really how this was approached in the past. Then with BERT coming out by Google in 2018, it became easier, so you could prompt your way to some extent and get good results, right? Or do a little bit of fine tuning, get good results. I think now with large language models where they are, it's become easier still. I think without getting into technology too much, I think the best way to get started is find data sets that excite you, data sets that you know a good bit about. And then think about, okay, with this data set, what value can you derive for the end user that's more informed, maybe helps basically helps unlock new value, right? So I'll give you an example. If you love movies, you could take user reviews and critics reviews from lots and lots of movies, and you come up with different summaries saying what do people think about the acting or the plot or the production value or the soundtrack, right? So instead of just giving a one like sum it all a summary for the movie, both from the user side and the critic side, you could analyze different dimensions, right? And to analyze different dimensions, you need to be able to use a large language model tag what reviews are about acting, what reviews are about the director, or the soundtrack, or the production value, or the pacing, or the plot. And then once you break it down to different dimensions, you could then generate a summary based on just that context. And while this is a dummy data set in some ways and a dummy project, you start building skill sets that allow you to work on similar data sets in the wild, so in production for clients, because all of them require similar kind of breaking down the problem, finding value, and then delivering that value using large language models.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It's again, let me know if you agree. People who approach analyzing unstructured data uh, often find it initially difficult. I don't know if you experienced this, marrying it with some of the more conventional statistical thinking, which looks at numbers, for example. Um, did you ever have that challenge, or how would you advise people to navigate that? Because you're literally looking at like an unquantified data point or an unquantified data set, literally words and texts. And a lot of people get stuck with the idea of just counting text, which is probably where it initially starts. But now with large language models, it's obviously much more complex. So for people starting out in NLP and dealing with that kind of data, I mean, what's a good kind of thought process to follow before it, like in your case, you turned it into like training signals or ways of helping people with in finance. I find
Yeah.
that a really interesting merger.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the past you would have had to count tokens. You would have to figure out like the frequency of certain tokens relative to the corpus, right? So using techniques that are still relevant but maybe not as commonly used. I think nowadays the easiest way to work with a lot of textual data is to convert them into embeddings, right? So converting the text into numerical vectors that you can then use to build classifiers from or any decision-making model. So if you want to do sentiment analysis, you could create the classes for the different sentiment that you want, and then train a classifier, maybe using gradient boosting, right? So like a light GPM model. I think where I would start is there is so much incredible information on how to do NLP well, particularly modern NLP on the web. Certainly great books, but I think there's a lot of great blog posts and great hands-on examples on the web. We didn't have that 10 years ago, right? We didn't have that in some ways even 6, 7 years ago, even 5 years ago. It was still a little bit scarce. I think now there's just great tutorials that you could walk through. You can understand why did someone approach a problem in a particular way. And then what happens is that you develop that skill set. For me, when I was starting off, really getting deeper into NLP, I would love to look at Kaggle competitions and see how people solved the problems to win first, second, or third place in some of these competitions. And even though there are many ways to slice the problem, you could see that people approach in unique ways to get first, second, or third. And you learn about alternative approaches, maybe techniques that you haven't tried that you should try. But I think the best learning can come from hands-on learning, right? I think if you get too in the weeds and just do theoretical, space changes too fast. And unless you're doing NLP research, you don't need you don't need to go super deep on the theory. You should develop some understanding so you develop intuition. But what's more valuable is the applied, the implementation, getting hands-on. So I'd start there, particularly if you're looking to be an NLP engineer that's applied, as opposed to an NLP researcher.
Yeah, it's a fair point. People usually come in two forms: people who learn by the book and are trying to apply stuff, and I take it you're more of the other type who learn by applying stuff, making mistakes, and then you're writing the books, which is awesome. Maybe can we shift a little bit into being an author? So what inspired you to write these books? And it seems like it doubles down on your background in NLP. So like, the experience of being an author, and maybe there are other aspiring authors out there, some ideas that you can share with them.
Yes, absolutely. The first book that I wrote with O'Reilly came out of actually conversations where a book publisher that was non-O'Reilly reached out to me in late 2017 about unsupervised learning. And at the time, I was working deep on unsupervised learning for an Israeli startup called Theta Ray to find basically fraud, money laundering, any sort of like really bad actor items in large data sets, particularly for insurance and for banking. And when I saw that request come through, I realized that the reason why this publisher wanted to write on this topic was unsupervised learning wasn't really covered well, right? Supervised learning, using labeled data to build models, that was covered maybe like 90 to 10, right? So for every 9 of supervised, you might have something on unsupervised. It might even be more like just lopsided than that. But the thing that I saw was that this topic wasn't well covered. And so I realized that this deserved to be covered. I was in a really great position to do so because I was working on unsupervised learning at the time. And then I said, well, if I'm going to write this book, who's the best publisher to get this book out with? And then I realized O'Reilly Media, is the biggest technical publisher in my mind, and one of the most reputable. And so I reached out to them saying, hey, I really know about this topic. I think it's underserved. I think a lot of people should know more about this topic than they do today. And I wrote the book in 2018. We published it in 2019. And I think actually this book continues to do very well because it is still to this day an area that a lot of people don't write about, right? Because supervised models people write a lot about, computer vision people write a lot about, even NLP people write a lot about, especially now. Unsupervised learning is still not that well covered. And then the second book I wrote came out of the success of the first book. So in 2019, I said, hey, book writing was really fun. I still have some time to go and do another book. So I said, NLP is super hot, right? Coming out of BERT in 2018. And so I for this one, got a co-author, started the writing process in 2020, and then published in 2021. The challenge there, though, is NLP moves so fast. So basically, by the time I wrote it in 2021, a lot of the material there, while still relevant, it had changed, right? Large language models, GPT-3, and other LLMs really started taking hold to a point where a lot of that book, while it's still relevant, it's a little bit dated compared to where the large language model space is just 2 years later. And I imagine that there's going to be quick advances. So a year from now or a year and a half from now, there are going to be dramatically more advances versus today, where you will actually need an updated book even beyond that to continue to stay on top of the latest trends in NLP in particular.
Yeah, maybe I'll hit that button immediately because that's the hot button now. A lot of the work in large language models, and even computer vision with the image generation tools really took a very, very different turn with the emergence of transformer architectures, diffusion architectures. So as an NLP practitioner, can you talk a little bit about that? Let's just open the hood. How do you think the thought process changed with the transformer, and how is it evolving now?
So I think the transformer architecture really came about in 2017 and then progressed in 2018. I think before then, you really had to work on like, I would say, handcrafted feature extraction, right? You had to basically you would convert text into embeddings, but you needed to build a lot of custom features that could then feed some NLP model to do what you wanted to do. And the other big challenge was that you couldn't work with long spans of text, right? And most of the NLP work at the time was like classification oriented or extraction oriented, like NER, named entity recognition. You couldn't do much more. You couldn't certainly generate 2 sentences even at the time. So generation wasn't really common. It didn't understand semantic context well, right? So semantic context became more of a thing once BERT came about in 2018. So I think transformer architecture allowed there to be greater semantic capture from the model. The model could attend to relevant portions of the text better because of attention mechanisms, which really are the backbone of the transformer architecture. And then you had basically a lot of knowledge that was acquired. So you had pre-trained language models for the first time. Before that, you really didn't have what I would consider pre-trained language models. And so BERT really changed things, right? The embeddings that you had semantic context. It could handle spans better than the past, and they were pre-trained, so you could do fine tuning on a smaller corpus because pre-training was done on a larger corpus. So Google made it easier to work on downstream tasks which required less fine tuning than they did before. I think with OpenAI's work on GPT-2 and then GPT-3 and then now GPT-4 as well, you could get zero-shot or few-shot learning done, and that was not possible at all in 2018. 2018, you still needed thousands of examples to build a good model, fine-tuned model. Now, you could do few-shot or even zero-shot learning and get really great results. Now, of course, if you have hundreds or thousands of examples, you get mind-blowing results, right? And that's something that we do at Multimodal. We do pre-training, we do fine-tuning for our customers in specific domains. And the performance is an order of magnitude better in many ways than what could have been possible pre-modern LLMs, right? Modern large language models. But the transformer architecture really changed things coming out in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many threads. Maybe I'll go with you mentioned zero shot, and of course, if you have context fed to the model, it makes it just makes it more intelligent, or it makes it answer more intelligently. One of the common criticisms of large language models, usually from statisticians, is it's just a glorified autocomplete. So this is more of your opinion. How do you deal with that reaction, and what's the intuition behind? In my case, predicting next word seems to be the task at hand, but somehow these models are able to reason or are able to form, ideas and concepts, and that for me is always mind blowing, especially if you provide additional context, like when you prompt something with additional information. Do you have any thoughts on this and the intuition behind it?
So I would say, a couple of years ago, maybe these models were only good for autocomplete. I don't think that's true anymore. The way I look at it is I think a lot of people give too much credit to humans, in the sense that humans, in a way, are similar to these models in the sense that we learn patterns, right? We learn from our experience in the real world. We understand what separates a cat from a dog. We learn about the world around us, and then based on the patterns we learn, we're able to make determinations, right? So it's only because we've learned these prior patterns are we able to go and do new things. Even if we write an essay, for example, right, or write a report, or come up with an idea, it's not coming out of nowhere. In many ways, it's a distillation of ideas that we've acquired along the way through learning, either through books or courses or formal education or just experiential, just learning from the real world. And then we use that, we distill that into new content. These large language models are operating pretty much by the same measure, right? They are learning context from having been trained on lots of web data, for example, that's been crawled primarily. And it's able to acquire this knowledge, and then it's able to take this knowledge and then generate new content. Now, sometimes the new content is very similar to the old content. But many times the content is actually novel, it's new, it's creating, right? It's adding to the repository of knowledge as we know it, particularly the latest large language models that we've seen in the last couple of months. So it's not just going and distilling something that it knew, it's actually being used to go and make determinations going forward. And I'll give you an example. On Multimodal, we focus a lot on complex workflows. So basically, can you take a insurance claims process and then make a determination, just like a human would? Take all the documents are submitted by the person that files the insurance claim and corroborate whether all the files are there, and then whether the current policy applies, and if so, to what extent, and then it makes a determination, right? So it's able to take all of this knowledge and then make a determination. The reason why I can make that determination of very high quality is because when we train our models at Multimodal, we are training them on prior insurance claims, right? Insurance claims and decisions that were made, and the model learns basically new knowledge so that it could apply this new knowledge going forward. That's the same thing if you get an insurance claims officer hired at an insurance company. That person has to learn from experience, learning through past decisions that were made and why they were made. So they're getting onboarded, right? They're picking up new knowledge, and only then can they make determinations in the future. Same thing with large language models. They're fed information in the past to then make determinations going forward. That is very similar whether it's a human or an AI. So I think we can't dismiss AI as being just an autocomplete. Oh, it's learned previous patterns and then now it's extrapolating from those, because humans pretty much do the same thing, right? When they extrapolate in novel ways, it's genius. And I think these large language models are in some cases also are approaching that territory. I think one thing we also have to realize is that these large language models are still fairly new. It's a fairly new technology. But if we advance at the pace that we are, it doesn't take long, 5, 10 years, 15 years maybe, for this to get into a really crazy place where now all of a sudden you're wondering whether, what makes human intelligence different from AI intelligence, because the lines are blurring, right? And I could see very much that possibility, given the progress that we've seen in this space to date. So I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss this technology. I think a lot of AI can do the work that a lot of knowledge workers do today. And so our objective as humans is to work alongside these new knowledge workers, these AI agents that are coming up, because they can add a lot of value, helping us do work that we need to get done. But in no way is our AIs dumber than humans. In some ways, they could be at human level capacity, which I think people should take very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, let's stay with this kind of conceptual level for just a few more minutes. I think my view is what throws a lot of people off are people who are kind of used to kind of traditional machine learning, where you really have to teach a model from scratch with data. And then on the flip side, so if you don't have enough data, or your data is not clean, or your whatever target variable supervised learning didn't work too well, then the model ends up being dumb. And then on the opposite extreme, you have people who are now arguing a little bit of what you said, that there are these emergent insights or emergent ideas coming out of these models. It certainly seems that way from time to time. You ask a question and it comes up with something really awesome. And then I don't know if there's really a middle ground where it might feel emergent, but it might just be a function of you just haven't seen that data point before. But these models have been trained on pretty much more text than you will ever read in your life. That they've seen
right.
it. So I don't know where do you sit in that spectrum. And obviously with the fine tuning and the RAG architectures, it can be a little bit of everything, right? You can in a way tell a model to focus on a particular domain, and it does very, very well. So where's your intuition on this? Where are we on that spectrum?
So I think where I'm at right now is these models, particularly when fed enough context, are sometimes better than humans, sometimes worse than humans. I think it really depends on the task, right? And I think that's a crazy thing that's happened. So I'll just give you an example. I think the average human is a worse writer than large language models. I think large language models are better writers than the average human. Now that's a crazy assertion, but I have seen this. Like I don't think it's too hard to corroborate. And so if the average human writer is worse than an AI, that doesn't mean human writers are out of jobs, but that does mean that the average human writer likely should use AI, right? Because the AI is going to write better. I mean, it should certainly use AI as a starting point and then go from there. The best human writers, the ones that are super creative, they're like advancing the art of writing. AI may play a very small role, right? I mean, it still can play a role in like doing research and maybe doing some proofreading, some rewrites maybe, but because the writing is so original, AI is not going to be able to necessarily do it, right? It's going to be more human driven, and so even there, AI is assisting, but maybe to a lesser level. And so I think the way I look at it is that AI is another form of intelligence, sometimes equal to human, sometimes worse than human, sometimes better than human, depending on where you are in that spectrum. And I think that's a crazy place, because I think that this version that I'm talking about is actually without any additional pre-training or fine tuning, right? So this is just using the base model without any customization, right? If you take a GPT-4 or Claude 2 or even a Llama 2 that's been a little bit more fine-tuned, let's say, like a Vicuna or Koala model, you could assert this that it's better than the average human writer at the very least, right? On different types of writing as well. It's also better than the average human at all sorts of tests, like legal exams or medical exams, or even in certain fields like math or engineering. It's better, right? Maybe even write better code, so it's better than the average coder, let's say. That is pretty serious. That's a pretty serious thing that I think we all have to learn how to adapt to. I think AI is still a tool. Like it's not like a human versus AI. I think it's a human plus AI. And I think the humans that actually adapt to AI, like go and use it to help their creative process, their productivity, I think they're going to win. I think the thing that we focus on at Multimodal is we don't take the generic GPT-4 from an OpenAI. I think that's pretty good. I think we could get a whole lot better, because if you take a model like that and you pre-train it further in your specific domain, you fine-tune it on let's say your company's documents or databases or workflows, you give it enough context, like using RAG retrieval augmented generations, right? Using something similar to a vector database like Pinecone or Milvus, right? And then you use that approach, you could get to something that's materially better than GPT-4, like a fine-tuned model dialed in with enough context on your company's data. That's what we do at Multimodal, and what we've seen is it's crazy level of performance. I mean, in a lot of cases, we're automating 80-90% of some workflows. Now, that doesn't mean the people that are doing the workflows are out of a job. They move and do other tasks at the company, but what they used to do for a living, maybe even their primary function, changes, because now 80-90% of that is now being done by AI agents that we develop, right? So we've seen it firsthand. We think this is like the tip of the iceberg. I think a lot of people talk about AI as taking jobs or it's in the future. When done well, like AI can do a lot of the knowledge work that humans can. Again, it's not taking those jobs away. It's changing the nature of the job, right? But it is something that all of us have to contend with, and I think not enough people practically realize the implications just yet, but they will in the next 3 to 4 years, and that's, I think, something that everyone should start bracing for, not in a negative way, but just like adapting to new technology, like the internet, like mobile devices, for example.
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's shift closer to what you're doing at Multimodal, and it jives with some of the observations we're also seeing in the market, where there's that BCG study where consultants armed with ChatGPT outperformed the ones who didn't have ChatGPT. There was also a story in the call center where you had productivity across the board increases, but it's actually the less skilled workers who benefited more. And that talks to your point about these models are probably better than the average human. And I kind of agree that intuitively, if we think of, yeah, everyone might have the assumption that we exist on a bell curve. Everyone's in the middle and equal parts above and below the average. But if you think about things like the power curve or Pareto rule, where most of the productivity is shifted towards the outperformers and the rest of us are slackers, the average is actually shifted right or left, depending on how you look at it. And if that's where AI is, it's generally better than maybe 80% of humans. Now, anyway, that wasn't my question. The question is obviously the enterprise is the undiscovered country. Everyone's looking at using ChatGPT publicly, and you're cracking, ideas and how to use it within a company. So can you share a little bit about, what are the principles, what you do at Multimodal, and some tips on how enterprises should be approaching large language models and how to maximize them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and I think we focus on B2B. We focus primarily on mid-market enterprise as well. We don't touch B2C. I've seen great applications in B2C, and they're mostly automating things that individuals do, right? But typically, as an individual, you don't do any one thing in enough repetition where it's going to add that much ROI, right? So you might use ChatGPT to do certain tasks along the course of the week, but you're not doing things in high volume. I think when we work with customers to the B2B mid-market enterprise space, these companies have a lot of things that they do, that their workers do on a daily basis, that are very, very repetitive and very high volume, particularly in certain industries like finance, legal, healthcare. where you're doing the same thing over and over again, and there's a pattern to it, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people, even at a company, right? If you're large enough, doing that particular thing, right? So I'll give you an example. All the big banks have onboarding process where they have to do know your customer or know your business. They're verifying based on the documents submitted the identity of different individuals or businesses, as well as their financial status. What's their income? What is their net worth? As well as doing some maybe background research to make sure that individual doesn't have anything that's like a red flag, right? That has to maybe then get reviewed further by additional humans to say, this account can open an account with this particular bank or can do this transaction or not, right? Particularly if it's politically sensitive or has some sort of exposure to elements that the bank doesn't want exposure to. That process is done by hundreds, if not thousands, of professionals, and this is an area that can be automated entirely away with AI. And the way we approach it is that we're taking the work that these individuals are doing that's very manual, very repetitive, and we break down the problem using a series of products that we have. So one of the products that we have is called Document AI. That product is primarily focused on classifying documents and extracting information from documents. So you get clean, structured data from the documents, similar to how humans would have to basically key in the values from the documents when those documents are submitted, right? That still happens typically with BPOs around the world where they are extracting information from documents. And once the numbers are punched in, then you could move to a downstream task. But that number punching is very manual. And if you could automate that with AI, and if you do so, you unlock huge amounts of ROI for the business, right? So we try to automate functions like that. Then the next area that this comes into play is called, for us, workflow AI, which is, okay, you've processed all the documents, you've keyed them in, they're in a database. Now you actually need to verify the income of the individual, looking at their bank statement, their pay stub, their tax returns, maybe a verification of employment letter that they have. All of this is now in a database, so you could corroborate across all those documents because they're already in clean form on those databases. An AI can do that. It can make that determination by pulling the relevant fields from the database and determining whether the income can be corroborated or not, right? Same thing with identity, right? And same thing for insurance claims processing in healthcare. Looking at legal contracts to see if there's cancelable language or not. Like, these are all wonderful areas where you needed a lot of people to go and make determinations. Now you can do that with AI, particularly this workflow AI product. And our third major product is called Product AI, which is essentially AI that helps your product use what large language models are best at, which is retrieving information. So basically, you could have a chatbot-like experience on your underlying documents and databases. So you could ask it a question similar to how you would in ChatGPT, and instead of drawing information from the public web, it actually uses your internal docs and databases to retrieve the answer, which is really awesome because it helps internal people get answers to their questions faster, and it allows customers, let's say customers of a bank, to understand, what is their account balance, where is their mortgage application, when is their statement going to be issued for the next credit card balance that they owe money for. All these questions that right now people are answering, all of that information is available. It sits in databases. If we introduce AI into the product and introduce this conversational experience, then you could get that answer faster. Again, removing that particular function that is so human reliant today and using AI to do so. So typically we don't try to build in completely novel areas because there's enough work with AI that you could do with existing workflows. So we're starting there, helping unlock lots of ROI for these businesses. And then the people doing these roles, the nature of their job changes, but they end up creating more value. They actually become more valuable to the bank after they retrain because they're working on more complex, even higher value items, right? Maybe they're looking at the really thorny KYC, KYB processes that require additional human review, but 80% of what they used to do is now being done with AI.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I mean, you mentioned document AI, workflow AI, and product AI. Actually, maps quite nicely to some of the things I've been talking about. Just to simplify, because people keep asking, what's the value of large language models if it's not something like
Mhm.
statistical? And I keep telling them, hey, it's content driven. If it's productivity, it's creativity, or in your case, with your product AI, it's knowledge management. The hardest thing for many enterprises to tackle is basically your existing stock knowledge is so hard to retrieve from traditional databases, and you need this layer of humans to do all of the query work. In a way, that's what you're automating.
Mhm.
I just realized we're almost at the hour, and we barely scratched the surface. Um, I want to talk about two more things before we conclude. And certainly, we hope to have another episode after this. Um, Obviously, we can't talk about generative AI or AI without touching a little bit on the ethics and the safety side. And I'm happy to say, at least from where I sit, the conversation has shifted to a bit more practical discussion. I mean, it started with a lot of doom and gloom.
Mhm.
People are going to lose their jobs, Terminator, and there's
Yeah.
still a little bit of that happening. But now it's more about how can we maximize this? How can we improve productivity, which I much prefer talking about. But there are existing safety and ethics issues. So what's your take on that conversation? Any top things that we'd rather be focused on other than the existential stuff that other people keep talking about?
Yeah, I mean, right now on the existential bit, I don't think it is an existential crisis. I think hard to imagine 20, 30 years from now what that could be. Right now, I don't think that's the case. I feel that it's a tool that enables humans to be more productive, similar to the internet or mobile devices. So it adds to human capacity and human productivity. It will require adjustment from people, right? I don't want to downplay that, because adapting to a new technology is always hard, particularly if you've always done a certain thing a certain way. Now AI is kind of encroaching on your turf. How do you adapt to it, right? But I think from the ethics side, I think it's really, really important that we handle data safely and securely. So one big challenge with large language models is it's trained on a lot of data. A lot of that data um, may be data that is sensitive, right? It's also, it has like PII, so personally identifiable data. And how are we handling that? How do we prevent it from getting into the public sphere? Um, and I think it comes down to having really good data agreements with people that interact with AI. So a lot of the data that people are sending into a large language model, that can be stored and used for training future models, or it can be used just for that benefit of that particular customer. And our take is it's much, much better to use models that you completely own on your infrastructure, right? That's secure, that provisioned separately from anyone else's data. So if you're a company, very large company, you have data on your customers, you need to have a large language model that operates within your infrastructure with the database that you have, and the data doesn't leave your walls. If you do that, at least you have a little bit more control into the use of that data. Otherwise, if you're giving it away to an external player, like an OpenAI even, you lose control, right, of that data. Particularly, it's very sensitive data that is sensitive to your customers, to your users. So I think that's one big thing, is how do you create enough guardrails and gates around how data is used. Um, and then the other big thing is making sure that when you train the model, it doesn't introduce new biases, because the models basically acquire knowledge based on the training data. And if the training data itself is biased, then the model becomes biased. And I think companies have done this well. Like I think OpenAI has done this well. I think Meta, surprisingly, has done a pretty good job of making sure that their model Llama 2 is not as biased as some of the other models that I've seen on the market, right? So it's very important that the training process, and this is on applied AI researchers to do a good job of, is make sure the training data is not biased, because then that bias becomes propagated by the large language model itself. And then I think it's also really important that when you build AI agents like we do at Multimodal, we need to ensure that the decisions that they make aren't biased as well, right? Just like you would when humans make decisions, is no different. But we need to observe AI and the decisions AI makes, particularly if it's sensitive, like finance or healthcare or legal, right? These are very sensitive domains. We need to have oversight of the decision-making process by sampling, for example, decisions that are made to make sure that they're free of biases, um, in the same way that we would have oversight for human decisions. So it's no different in that regard.
Yeah, I think you've already prescribed pretty much the the general skeleton of an ethics framework. Um, I think one of the long-standing hesitations for some companies about large language models is really the fact that they had no role to play in training them, so they had no control over what how the data came in. You know, to what extent do you think fine-tuning or RAG mitigates this? Similar to hallucinations, right? People are worried about
Yeah,
hallucinations,
yeah.
but if you provide context, hallucinations just go away for the most part. So what about bias? Do you think that's something that can be mitigated to some extent?
So RAG's not going to necessarily eliminate bias. I actually do like RAG a lot, but it is a weak form of providing context to a model because you're limited how much context you could provide, whether it's 32K if you're using GPT-4, 32K, even if you go up to 100K, right? It might not be enough context or complete context. We take a very different approach at multimodal. I think others will start adopting a playbook like ours, which is we actually take a base model like Llama 2 model, so Meta's Llama 2, 7 billion. We pre-train it, so train it additionally on customers' data or their particular domain, and that way we index more to their existing documents, like the existing knowledge that they have, um, and that allows us to then get a model that's more tuned to their space and to their customer base and the way of doing business. And then we do fine tuning. So fine tuning is much more powerful. Pre-training and fine tuning are much more powerful than just RAG, right? Because fine tuning actually changes the model weights, which then you could use for future generations. And so we like aligning the model with whatever our customers' needs are and then applying it there. Again, we work with larger customers, larger businesses. So we have the luxury of doing the additional pre-training and fine-tuning. I think if you're not working with a large business that has the resources and the time and the data to go and do pre-training and fine-tuning, then it becomes a more difficult decision. I think RAG can help you get better alignment, which is why I do like it when you don't have enough budget or enough resources. But I think we'll start seeing better techniques to identify bias, right? And that's going to come from the research community. So a lot of these models, particularly open source models, they will be scored on different dimensions for bias. And that way, I think models will get rubber stamped and saying like this is safe to use in the workplace model, and so people using that to do RAG feel comfortable that it's been rubber stamped by an institution or a group, right? It could even be an open source group, but somewhere where the community has said this model is good to go. So I do think there will be self enforcement from the industry at large or the open source community at large. I'm much more confident that will happen. I'm less confident that regulators will get it right, just because it's a very difficult topic to regulate. That I feel regulators like don't have enough context yet, whereas I think the collective wisdom of the open source community is more likely to get there faster.
Yeah, I would have loved to talk more about regulation, but maybe we'll save that for the next episode.
Yeah.
So a few minutes left. Maybe let's end with any thoughts about where the near term, developments in generative AI are going to go. It doesn't even have to be the tech, maybe the adoption or how people treat it, and then maybe some last words or advice for our viewers and maybe aspiring AI founders.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think on the modeling side, you're going to see larger context models. So I think the 100K model from Anthropic is one of a kind right now, but I think you'll see many more larger context models because RAG is really great when you have large context windows, right? Max sequence length, the amount of tokens that you can pass into the prompt. And so since RAG is so popular, I think larger context windows are really, really important. So I think you'll start seeing more of those. I think this is not necessarily in the near future, but in the next 12 months, I think you will see multimodal models, right? Models that can handle images, videos, text, not just text, right? Which is why we're also named multimodal, because we believe in that future. It's not just text, even though we're starting with text today. I think the movement is to smaller models, not larger models, smaller models that are faster, faster and cheaper. And I think the open source community has also adopted that mentality, which is how can you run on a single GPU or even on a CPU in some cases, and have similar performance to a larger model, right? I think the research community loves setting benchmarks like state-of-the-art performance, and they usually use very large models on very expensive hardware to do so. But when you get into production, you want smaller models that are faster that you could run cheaply at scale. So I think that trend will continue. I think in terms of adoption on the consumer side, I think you're going to see very superficial AI products, which is okay, but products that are basically wrapping around some OpenAI capability, for example, but you'll see that sprinkled everywhere. Lots of features on the consumer side, the B2C side, where it's doing summarization, right? Or it's giving you a chatbot experience in your workflow. I think you're going to see a lot of that. I think you're also going to see products that are AI company products that are more or less just wrappers on OpenAI, especially in B2C. And I think that's difficult because there's no defensibility, right? You can just switch from one product to another. So I think a lot of money is going into like AI companies. I think just be wary that if you're a founder, particularly if you're an AI founder, try to find some unique angle to what you do. It could be marketing and sales, so basically a wrapper around OpenAI is fine. But if your defensibility is supposed to be tech and you're just wrapping around OpenAI, that's not going to be what separates you from the competition. Your model is not going to be any different than what others are doing. What you do want to do is have unique data around your particular problem. And then you do want to do the hard work of pre-training and fine-tuning the model, right? Similar to what we're doing for our clients at Multimodal. You want to make sure you do that and you build defensibility, particularly if you get more customers in your domain that allows you to have a data advantage that you can then build on top of. I think with B2B, the adoption will be all over the board. But I think more companies are going to do automation of workflows, like similar to what our thesis is at Multimodal. I would be surprised if there are not many more companies that try to do what we do. Right? I think that's going to be prevalent. Either they're going to go to a vendor like us and buy a product from us, or they're going to do it in-house, because that's low-hanging fruit. If you could make your workers more productive because AI can do more of the knowledge work that they used to do, why wouldn't you, right? And I think this is also going to be true on the coding side, helping programmers program faster, code faster, right? And do code reviews, do documentation, write comments, write tests for code. I think you're going to see a lot of that as well. I think there's so many use cases that I can't even think of today that no one's really thought of today that are going to come about. If you look at mobile apps, like no one would have really imagined Uber coming out necessarily and being as big as it was, or ride sharing, right? We're going to get similar types of applications that people haven't even thought of yet that are going to be super disruptive, that are only brought about because this technology has now matured. And I recommend to would-be founders or current founders to go think of those, right? To go and think of crazy big ideas and then go work on them. That's certainly a big avenue for you to build something very large in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it. We talked about a lot of stuff, but again, we barely scratched the surface. So I want to thank you, Ankur, for joining me in AI Conversations, and I hope to see you again in another episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a blast. Look forward to future conversations on this. Thanks for having me.